So, it's really important for us to know that we have Saint Herman of Alaska as our heavenly patron. And he's a great saint, and he's a great example for us as Orthodox Christians, and his life is very important for us to know. But not only to know the events of his life, but also to remember that he is there, he's praying for us, he will come to our help if we ask him, and that Saint Herman is a great intercessor not only for each one of us, but and for our parish, but also for the whole Orthodox Christian Church in North America. Saint Herman was Russian. He grew up in near Moscow, and as a young boy, he entered a monastery, and then a little bit later on, he went to Valom. And Valom is a wondrous place. It's on an archipelago, a whole series of islands in the far north, in a huge lake. And the lake is so big that it has waves, it has tides, and it even has seals of its own kind of seals and its own kind of fish. It's the biggest lake in Europe, and it's very far north. It's as far north as Fairbanks, Alaska. So, if who here? I know there's some people here who've been to Fairbanks, right? To Alaska. Anybody's been to Alaska? Well, that's pretty far north, right? And so it's a land of pine trees and of lots and lots of snow in the wintertime, and it's very cold. But Saint Herman went there at a time when the monastery was just being refounded. The monastery had been destroyed by Swedish invaders, and it was laying in desolation. And there was a wonderful holy man by the name of Elder Nazari, who was sent from the monastery of Sarov. And Father Nazari had been a leader within the monastic community at Sarov, and he had lots of spiritual children. And one of his spiritual children was Saint Seraphim. Everybody's heard about Saint Seraphim, right? Okay, yeah. Yeah? Well, we have his icon in the narthex, and Saint Seraphim is a really amazing saint. And on his feast day, I'll tell you more about him, because I've had a great chance to be in his presence. And Saint Herman, so Saint Herman was his spiritual brother. You all know what it's like to have natural brothers and sisters, right? Well, there's also spiritual brothers and sisters. And so in the monastery, they're all spiritual brothers. Well, Elder Nazari, who was the spiritual father, got sent up to Valom to renew the monastery. Saint Seraphim stayed behind. But Saint Herman was one of those monks who came when Elder Nazari was very new at Valom. And he set about rebuilding the monastery. And when he got there, he was faced with basically a pile of ruins, and there was still a little church, and there were a few lay people living there who were fishermen, and there were 2 priests and 2 monks who were kind of, leaderless. And the 2 priests went out fishing and drowned, and the 2 monks, nobody knows what happened to them. So Elder Nazari and a few young monks like Saint Herman were basically alone to begin renewing this monastery. Now, Valom Monastery was big, and so it was a very formidable pile of ruins. Can you imagine? Like a small town being in ruins, and now you're in charge of it. So they started building buildings. They got help. They got money. They got people to come and help them. And not only did they start building a beautiful monastery, insofar as buildings and things, but they started building a spiritual brotherhood of men who really were being transformed by the grace of the Holy Spirit. They became holy. They became full of love and compassion, and they cast out of themselves all their selfishness. Can you imagine what it's like to live with a group of people who are not selfish? It's really amazing. It's an amazing thing. And Saint Herman was one of these. And Saint Herman matured very quickly. He was 16 when he went to the monastery. And so after a number of years in the monastery, maybe 10 years in the monastery, he already had the blessing to go be a hermit. And he went to a little clearing in the woods, right on the edge of a field. And that field is still there to this day, and it's called Saint Herman's Field. And when I was there in 1993, because Vallam is where I began my monastic life, we went and we planted a cross on the site of Saint Herman's hermitage. Remember, we just sang that together we lift high the holy cross you planted firmly in America. Well, there we lifted high the holy cross first, and then we planted it. It's better to lift it high first and then plant it than plant it and then lift it up. Saint Herman lived there in solitude as a hermit. And what do you think hermits do in solitude? They pray, right? But they pray because they're so spiritually advanced that they can see the angels. They pray with the angels. And so Saint Herman lived in this beautiful, quiet solitude, and would go to the main monastery for the big services. Well, it came around about the year 1793. There was the head of the Russia-America Company, because the Russians had started to establish commercial ventures, hunting for seals and getting seal skins and otter skins and all of these things which were very popular on the market. You can imagine living in northern Russia. You want a fur coat, right? And it wasn't politically incorrect at that time. But there was a big need for good quality furs, and North America was pretty much untapped. So the Russians had expanded all the way to Alaska and then down the coast. You have to remember that all of Northern California, all the way up to Alaska, was Russian territory at one time. And they established a mission in the town of Kodiak. They'd established the town of Kodiak, which is on an island. What's Kodiak famous for?
Bears.
Bears. Big bears. Bears that are 4 times the size of a man. Okay? These are really big bears. You can imagine somebody 4 times the size of a big guy. So the Archbishop of St. Petersburg asked Elder Nazari to send monks as missionaries. Now, this was probably not an easy thing, because once you get a monastic brotherhood together, it's a group that works closely together, that loves one another, that supports one another. And so to take 10 guys out of maybe 30 or 40, that's a big thing. But they all were able to work closely together, and they knew each other, and they had relationship with one another. And so they left in 1793, and it took them an entire year to get to Kodiak. An entire year. Now, Vallam is on the border with Finland. You know where Finland is? Okay, it's north of St. Petersburg. and they had to go all the way across Siberia, and then they had to go across part of the North Pacific to get to Alaska. And how do you think they got to Siberia? They got across Siberia by foot. How else? They took barges on rivers. How else? No, they didn't have planes back then. How about dog sleds? Because think about it, Siberia is very far north, right? We had a lady visiting us this morning, but she had to leave early, who's from Yekaterinburg, which is in Siberia. It's pretty chilly there. Siberia means the north. So they went by foot, they went by dog sled, they went by barge because there's huge rivers. And eventually they got to the coast of Asia on the Pacific. And then they had to take a ship. And so they took a ship all the way to Kodiak. Well, you know, this company, the Russia-America company, didn't exactly expect 10 months. And so they basically were landed on Kodiak, and they had to make their own way. They had to build their own house. They had to build a church, and they had to establish themselves first, and to be able to live before they could start doing their missionary work. And they came at the end of September, and in the year 1794. Now, what do you think it's like in Kodiak, Alaska, at the end of September? It's cold. It's stormy, right? There's lots of storms. And so the monks, they did all of this in the wintertime. That was tough. And it rains a lot. And so they got to know the townspeople. There were some Russians and a lot of Aleuts, a lot of Native Americans. And their mission that they were commissioned was to convert the Americans to Orthodoxy. And it didn't matter what language the Americans spoke, because these Americans that they encountered spoke Aleut, and they spoke Yupik, and they spoke Tlingit, and they spoke other Indian languages, right? So they set out, and there were 2 priest monks and an archimandrite. The archimandrite was in charge of everything, and the 2 priest monks would go out as missionaries. Well, one of the priest monks, the priest monks were, once they got started, were arguing one day. And they were arguing about who would get to be the apostle to go to a certain area and bring the gospel to the people there. And Saint Herman said he overheard that argument, and he was very encouraged as to who would get to be the apostle. Now, there was one of those priest monks whose name was Juvenali. And Saint Juvenali, oh, I just let the cat out of the bag.